Today, some of the fires are still burning, only a few of about 30 all over the city. This reporter has covered wars and undeclared wars, riots and revolutions some 15 years. But the night here in Belfast was the worst single night of violence I've ever seen. And that includes Nicosia and Cypress, Beirut in the Lebanon, Algiers in Algeria, Leopoldville in the Congo.
In the 1950s and 60s, Frank Kearns was the go-to guy at CBS News for dangerous stories in Africa and the Middle East. When the number of times he faced death reached 114, he stopped counting.
You need someone like Frank to go out into uncomfortable places, dangerous places, and get the story.
The battle moves to the rooftops now. Rooftop sniping on all the roofs. This man just behind me, just as we came up the stairs, a bullet nicked about 1 foot from his head. Yeah, very funny.
You saw it was courage. I mean, in everything he pulled off. You know, war after war. He covered every damn war in Africa in the years that he was a journalist. Didn't miss one.
I would have thought that Frank was highly successful and and absolutely one of the best CBS correspondents I ever came across, and I saw a lot of them.
This is Frank Kearns in Gaza. Now back to Walter Cronkite in New York.
I don't know where, under what circumstances he grew up, what the influences on him were, what made him into what he was. But he was a cosmopolitan man in the best sense of the word, and very fruitful, very important to CBS News. And in the end deserved better than the way his reputation worked out.
Frank said to me, "I think I have to tell you something." He said, "This evening on the evening news, all hell's going to break loose." And I said, "Why?" And he was very upset, and he said, "CBS is going to tell the world that I was a spy for the CIA."
In the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate, the United States Senate established a committee to investigate alleged misdeeds by American intelligence services. They were particularly interested in the CIA's covert relationships with the American media, both for collecting intelligence and for cover. On the CBS Evening News, February 10, 1976, correspondent Daniel Shore reported that CBS News President Sig Mickelson told the Senate committee that two of his reporters in the 1950s, Frank Kearns in Cairo and Austin Goodrich in Stockholm, were employed by the CIA.
Kearns, now a journalism professor at the University of West Virginia, commented, "I deny it."
During all the years I was a CBS News staff correspondent, I had no connection whatsoever, none, with the CIA or any other intelligence agency. Frank Kearns.
In his denial, Kearns omitted his earlier years in Cairo, where he worked part-time for the network. Often he was seen there in the company of certain Americans with whom he shared the same values and ideals, as well as friendships going back to the war years in London. They were CIA. The story of Frank Kearns, CBS, and the CIA is one of long-standing and complicated relationships. It started with Kearns' absolute belief that America and its ideals were endangered by the spread of the Soviet Union's influence and its model of a totalitarian society. He accepted the propaganda used by the U.S. government and its outlets in the media, which warned of the Red Menace and the danger of nuclear Armageddon in the 1950s.
There are important stakes in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Let's not minimize this. When it comes to Europe, for example, Washington and Moscow are fighting to become the dominant power on the continent after World War II. And they're doing that politically and by building up their militaries and by providing economic aid.
But this was a different kind of conflict. One government official described it as a war that isn't a war.
The black portion of the map is the communist-dominated part of the world controlled by the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist regime.
This was a Cold War with differing views of truth. It was waged with sophisticated government propaganda on both sides. Its outlet in the United States was an emerging new medium called television.
When Americans see the world on their television screens in the 1950s, one of the captivating but also terrifying things about this Cold War is that it could be a nuclear Armageddon. It could be the end of our days.
Frank Kearns was one of the reporters crusading for the American truth. He understood what was at stake for the United States and its Western allies. By the time he landed in Cairo in 1953, the Middle East was in turmoil, and his career in broadcast news was set.
This is an all-out Cold War out here with no holds barred, and any objective reporter must report in full conscience in diplomacy, in the cultural field, especially in the economic field. The Soviet bloc is penetrating the Middle East with consistent and constant and almost frightening success.
Half a world away from Egypt, Frank Kearns grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia, in the center of Appalachia. His father was an engineer who worked in the coal fields and later in the aviation industry in Washington, D.C. His mother was one of 5 girls in a close-knit family. Kearns graduated from West Virginia University in 1938, ready for his first assignment as a journalist.
His parents were against him going into journalism. They I don't know, they saw him in a doctor, lawyer, that sort of profession. And but as my grandmother once said to me, he had a will of his own, and there wasn't anything you could tell him to do. If he didn't want to do it, he wouldn't do it. And he knew from an early age he wanted to be a journalist.
He had an adventuring spirit about him, so he had a vision. He really worked at things. He was willing to take chances to do things, and I think that's what paid off in his career.
After college, Kearns wasted no time finding a job. He went to work as a city editor for his hometown newspaper.
And then somehow found himself as a cub reporter in Miami Beach.
But the United States entered World War II, so his next adventure would take place in the capitals of Europe.
World War II broke out, and I think he signed up. So he went to London. He spent 5 years in Europe.
He entered the army as an enlisted man and worked himself up the ranks, battlefield commission. He was affiliated with the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, catching spies.
The U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps in London was a small unit when Kearns arrived as a staff sergeant in June 1942. Its members were carefully selected for investigative counter-espionage service. Kearns shared a comfortable apartment with 2 other members of his unit, James Eichelberger and Miles Copeland. They worked as plainclothes investigators, carrying out background checks on military personnel. They also hunted for spies and saboteurs who tried to undermine the Allies' war effort.
They were hand-picked in Washington. And Miles was thrilled to be with such a wonderful group. And the first job that I remember Frank and Miles carrying out was to go around in England and try and find out whether there was loose talk and people were giving away secrets, and whether there were German spies inhabiting pubs and hoping people would give out with things that they shouldn't be talking about, which Frank and Miles certainly enjoyed very, very much.
When Copeland married Lorraine Addy, who worked for British intelligence, Frank Kearns was his best man. Their wartime friendship bound them later on in the frontiers of another, colder war.
They were best buddies. I mean, they were as one in the way they thought and their humor. And they were very close, yes.
By November 1942, Kearns was commissioned as second lieutenant. He worked in Eisenhower's headquarters. While in London, the 25-year-old Army lieutenant met a dancer from the Windmill Theater, Gwendolyn Shoring. They married on October 5th, 1943. 2 days later, Lieutenant Kearns was back at work, preparing for the Allies' invasion into Europe. Kearns went ashore at Normandy in August 1944. He followed the advancing troops into Paris, where he was promoted to captain and named commanding officer for counterintelligence. After securing the French capital, he moved with the Allies into Germany. Kearns' unit was responsible for arresting and interrogating captured Nazi officials, including members of the SS and Gestapo. In April of 1945, he entered Dachau with the 45th Division to free its 32,000 emaciated prisoners. He was emotionally overwhelmed by what he found.
Was one of the first people in there to liberate that camp. And he said the smell and the sights were just ghastly. So I guess he had to live with that the rest of his life. You don't forget things like that. It was sad.
It was obviously a very painful experience for him. I think it was for anybody who went through that. It's something that none of us today can imagine.
It was memories of that authoritarian regime that would later influence his reporting on wars, riots, and famines throughout the Middle East and Africa, especially in his early years at CBS. After the war, Frank Kearns went back to working as a journalist. He was signed by a literary agent in New York and wrote for magazines. He also worked as a radio newsman. He edited a manuscript for General Eisenhower's driver, K. Summersby, in 1948. The book quickly became an international bestseller. A close wartime friend, Captain Edward Sachs, recommended Kearns to the author and her publisher, Prentice Hall.
Ed Sachs was very instrumental in his career. He was a godfather type, in a way, in that he introduced them to the right people.
Ed Sachs was a very important corporate executive, and I know that he and Mr. Paley became good friends during World War II in London, and it was never clear to me exactly what role he played at CBS, except that he was very close to Mr. Paley.
During the war, Colonel William Paley, the owner of the CBS radio network that carried the nightly broadcasts of Edward R. Murrow into American homes, worked in the Office of War Information. While he was stationed in London, Paley met Edward Sachs, and the two became close friends. After the war, Sachs joined CBS in New York. He continued to advise the Department of Defense and the National Security Council in Washington. This provided a solid link between CBS and the government agencies that were working against the global threat of communism. It was into this entangled relationship that Ed Sachs invited Frank Kearns to join CBS as the network's reporter in Cairo in 1953. Miles Copeland and James Eichelberger, Kearns' old wartime roommates, were already there and working for the CIA.
When you talk about people meeting up in distant places, it's almost like a Graham Greene novel. So all of a sudden, you have Frank Kearns, the broadcast journalist. You have Miles Copeland, almost building up his own legend as a CIA operative. And then you have James Eichelberger, the head of the CIA station.
Shortly before Kearns, Copeland, and Eichelberger arrived in Egypt, a group of army officers staged a coup d'etat that overthrew the regime of King Farouk I. Lieutenant Colonel Jamal Abdel Nasser was one of its leaders. This action forced the Americans to pay even closer attention there. President Eisenhower wanted to know which way Egypt was leaning, to the West or to the communists.
The future of communism in the Middle East depends on the action of the Western countries, not completely on the action of Russia.
I remember clearly that Cairo was a central piece of the Soviet propaganda machine. And the Russians needed the Egyptians in order to serve as a base from which they could send forth their vision of the great new world.
But Egypt played a bigger role than simply being a base for Cold War propaganda. It was strategically important to Europe and the oil producers. 2/3 of the oil that was shipped through the Suez Canal went to Europe, and controlling the oil traffic aided Nasser's grand plan to unite the Arab countries. Although most Americans were paying little attention to the Middle East and North Africa, the Eisenhower administration knew that the long-standing British presence in Egypt was now shaky and needed American support. They were also concerned about a military buildup.
Let's get to the core of what we're talking about here. That is that the CIA is building up links in Egypt, this fast-changing country, this country that had been under British domination up until the early 1950s. But now you not only have gotten rid of the king, you have a new military government with these new figures, charismatic figures like Jamal Abdel Nasser. How are we going to find out about this group? How can we influence them? What can we do? You want to get as many people providing information as possible.
The CIA sent Miles Copeland and James Eichelberger to lead the effort. Copeland now worked for Booz Allen Hamilton, a management consulting firm that sometimes provided cover for the CIA. Eichelberger was the head of the CIA in Cairo.
There were so many CIA people there undercover of all sorts of things. I mean, Miles was supposed to be organizing the Ministry of the Interior. Frank was a news hound. Eichelberger had a special job doing something else. And it was like that. And there were people working in the airlines who kept an eye on the airport. And there were people undercover working in the embassy itself as like the commercial attaché or something.
Kearns moved his family into a spacious flat on an island in the Nile River. The area was filled with Egyptian government employees, foreign reporters, embassy officials, and of course, spies from every country with an interest in Egypt, the Suez, and North Africa.
The Eichelbergers lived not in maybe in the same building, I'm not sure, but very close by. And we all used to get together with parties back and forth. But at night, you could either go to a nightclub, which would have been disastrous probably, too much drink and loose talk, or you could go to each other's houses and have a party there, and that's what we did. We made our own entertainment.
And then, of course, all the personalities you see in movies like Good Night and Good Luck, many of them were at the apartment in Cairo at one time or another. I had the opportunity actually to meet Edward Murrow. I remember him meeting me and saying, "Good evening, young man," and I just remember lots of cigarette smoke, a lot. I could hardly see him.
Editors at CBS pressed Frank Kearns to sharpen his reporting in Egypt. One way to do this was to examine Nasser's plan for Arab unity.
Here now is CBS News correspondent Frank Kearns interviewing President Nasser.
Sir, you said recently in a speech, I believe, that you want to ease tension in the Middle East and in the world. At the same time, your powerful propaganda has been inciting trouble and continual trouble in Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, even the Sudan and Tunisia, and openly inciting racial feeling in Africa. How do you explain this?
It's my information that Nasser really liked him, and they got on as men can get on. I mean, I even have a picture of him on Nasser's yacht, piloting the yacht. They were almost friends.
Friends? Perhaps, but at arm's length. Frank Kearns got to know President Nasser through Miles Copeland and through his Egyptian cameraman, Youssef Masraf, or Joe, as he was called, who was hand-picked by Nasser to handle his official government photographs. Joe Masraf spoke several languages fluently. He was creative, hard-working, and very resourceful. It was easy to see why Kearns wanted him for CBS.
Frank must have got scoops that nobody else got, and access to Nasser and so on, which wasn't easy. I mean, he did give interviews at that time, but very restricted. It was very difficult to get an interview if you were just an ordinary correspondent who hadn't a hope.
In May of 1957, Kearns was asked to prepare an important cut-in for the second season of the CBS documentary program, The 20th Century, narrated by Walter Cronkite. His report was included in a two-part segment called The Red Cell, about the spread of communist propaganda in Egypt. It was written by Marvin Kalb.
As I remember it, Bud Benjamin and Ike Kleineman would think through the whole concept of the program and then assign reporters in Cairo, reporters in Stockholm, wherever, to do a piece of the broad concept that they had.
Finally, to the turbulent Middle East, where communism rides the coattails of Arab nationalism.
This is Frank Kearns reporting from the Middle East. Always the contrast. Washington the enemy, the warmonger, Moscow the friend, the lover of peace, the champion of peace. All this may sound over-pessimistic, but the picture here is pessimistic. After 5.5 years of covering the Arab world from North Africa to the Turkish border, I sincerely believe the communists are winning, we are losing. And like many another American out here, I'm depressed and tired of watching the communists win almost every single battle, of hearing their propaganda and Nasser's attacking the United States day after day, year after year. It's not only later than we think out here in the Arab world, it's almost too late.
Like others working in the 1950s, Kearns' reporting was dogmatic about the growing influence of communism. He filed reports about the presence of the Chinese, the Warsaw Pact countries, and the Soviet Union. At the time, the storyline was always us, the Americans, versus them, the communists. Little coverage was given to how the countries actually related to each other. According to Dr. Lucas, the real story in North Africa and the Middle East was that each country was more concerned about its own security than the standoff between the Americans and the Soviet Union.
So was it the case that Frank Kearns simply thought differently from the Egyptians with whom he was dealing, from the Algerians with whom he dealt? That he honestly believed that the Soviet threat was the major issue even when they did not? Or was he playing to an American audience? Was he simply giving the line that people wanted to hear back in the United States, even if that line didn't match up with reality? I wish I could get inside his head to try to understand.
Another contributor to Cronkite's program was Austin Goodrich, a CBS stringer in Finland.
The Russians outspend us in Finland by a considerable amount, and they have the manpower.
Kearns and Goodrich never met and never appeared on the same program again. But later on, their names would become profoundly connected in journalism history.
Our enemy in the Cold War was a very evil force. He really was. I use the word advisedly. It was evil.
We called where our husbands were working, in other words, the CIA, we called it the old glue factory, which was a way of not saying it's the CIA, not naming it. So amongst ourselves, we would refer to it as the old glue factory. It was a ploy. It was a subterfuge, I suppose, and also a bit of a joke.
Years later, Miles Copeland wrote about his time with the CIA in his book, The Game Player. He said he and Eichelberger used Frank's luxurious apartment as a headquarters. He later told historian Scott Lucas that Kearns' apartment was actually paid for by the CIA.
Now, there's a couple questions first of all, about this, and that is, was this specifically done for Frank Kearns, or was this done for any journalist who happened to then take up that apartment? Was it almost like what we would call a CIA safe house in this day and age?
Was Frank Kearns' apartment really a CIA headquarters? Or was Copeland, a gifted storyteller, exaggerating the nature of their relationship? Was there some kind of financial arrangement between Kearns and the CIA? Or was Frank Kearns simply a cooperative tool in the political engineering by his close friends, Copeland and Eichelberger? Miles Copeland provided a clue when he wrote in his memoir that Frank wanted to be involved in Cairo for the fun, but he refused to accept any official status with the CIA. Lorraine Copeland, on the other hand, saw it differently.
I certainly thought he was part of the CIA because he was so close to Ike and Miles, and they would certainly not have been that close and cohabited, so to speak, that closely if he hadn't been.
Sig Mickelson was president of CBS News while Frank Kearns was in Cairo. In this role, he was one of the network's key links between Chairman William Paley and his friends at the CIA. In his unpublished personal archives, Mickelson wrote that CIA Director Allen Dulles told him that Kearns was one of us. But the CBS chief told him that his reporter couldn't work for both, the CIA and CBS. Dulles asked for some time to work out the problem.
They were really dedicated, and they were all absolutely convinced that things that later on the CIA was criticized for doing, they were convinced that these were the right things to do for the sake of America. You know, they believed in their country, and they believed they would have to do what was necessary for the good of America.
In April 1957, Mickelson flew to Cairo to confront his reporter. There, Kearns told him that in order for them to talk about the CIA, they would have to go for a walk, where they could speak without being overheard. Mickelson said that's when Kearns told him that he'd rather work exclusively for CBS. A few months later, Mickelson said CIA officials showed him a Frank Kearns letter of resignation. He assumed it was genuine. Then the letter was destroyed. For its fall schedule that year, CBS planned to devote a full hour to Algeria's struggle for independence from the French. This decision coincided with growing dissent for America's head-in-the-sands policy on the Algerian question.
In '57, Senator Kennedy, JFK, made a speech on the Senate floor critiquing the French and urging the United States to use its moral weight to bring the war to an end, and that end would lead to autonomy or to sovereignty for Algeria.
The foreign editor asked Frank Kearns and cameraman Joe Masroff to report the Algerian side and to do something he called a bit unrealistic or impossible. He asked them to join Algeria's National Liberation Front, the FLN, using whatever contacts they had in Egypt and Tunisia. Here, Joe Masroff was very helpful.
If you were in a tight spot, if there was a roadblock you had to get by, if there was a really, really dicey situation with not very nice people, you wanted Joe Masroff at your side. He knew how to charm the birds out of the trees, or he knew where to put the $100 bill in the passport so that you could get past obstreperous officials. They were a wonderful team. Africa was not an easy place to work.
While they were embedded with the Algerians, Kearns kept a reporter's notebook that was shipped with their film back to CBS in New York. Part diary, part notes for the film editors, it detailed every encounter.
Our final instructions from CBS News in New York stressed that we have no axe to grind, that our only orders are for honest, objective reporting. And the truth, nothing more than the truth. Frank Kearns.
Kearns, Masroff, and their Algerian guides carried more than 400 pounds of television and radio gear. Trying to avoid French patrols and aircraft, they hiked across the border from Tunisia and through the mountains to reach a rebel camp. For the first time, an American TV reporter witnessed the Algerians' determination to take back their country.
This man claims the French have wiped out his entire family. Mother and father, 4 sisters, 1 brother, 4 uncles, 20 persons in all. These men are sincerely convinced that they are fighting for liberation and liberty. Other young ones have grudges against French treatment of Algerian Muslims.
Kearns and Mazarov spent 6 weeks behind the lines, recording the Algerian army as it fought the French. Their lives were constantly in danger. They believed that if they were discovered by the French, they would be executed.
Here on the spot, it sounds rather ridiculous to hear Washington. Comes the damn plane.
You know, he did so many of these very nasty stories, which, of course, his fellow professionals took off their hats to anybody who could cover those stories and come back alive and come back still smiling and still sort of relatively sane person.
I can report in absolute honesty that despite the experienced correspondent's natural cynicism, that despite continual mental probing and interviewing tricks, I find these people tragically hungry for independence, ready and willing to fight to the death for that independence and nothing less. They also say that even the lowliest peasant knows the difference between communism and democracy. They consider the communists as dangerous as the French and want no part in what they consider to be Russian imperialism. Frank Kearns.
Despite the perils presented at secret headquarters, in camps, and on risky patrols, the team from CBS survived. They helped to settle the question of communist influence, and they cautioned that the future could be decided if America failed to act.
If the undeclared war goes on for another year, perhaps 2 years, will the Algerians turn to the communists for arms? If my worst enemy hands me a red-hot poker, I have to take it. I have no choice. This is the attitude here in Algeria today.
The time behind enemy lines took its toll. Kearns and Mazarov lost 4 inches from their waistlines and 15% of their body weights. Kearns wrote to his parents that he was as skinny as a skeleton.
He came back as almost a cadaver, a very sick guy. They really had a rough time, and it showed. I mean, he looked like something out of a concentration camp. And my mother nursed him back to health.
The reaction among his colleagues was immediate. Eric Severide, who appeared at the end of the program to comment on the implications for the U.S., wrote to Kearns, "I admired your work for the Algerian show. I think you told this country something it did not know and needed to know. This was reporting at its best in the classic manner. Everyone concerned is aware of your accomplishment." The documentary, called Algeria Aflame, was broadcast on October 13, 1957. For Kearns and Mazarov, it won them the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Foreign Reporting, the George Polk Award for Distinguished Achievement in Journalism, and a Peabody Award for going behind current happenings to identify related problems and underlying causes. Time magazine said the program brought a tragic stalemate into sharp focus.
Being a war correspondent, in many ways, despite the dangers, can be very glamorous. It's certainly not a routine. And you're in a situation where you can say to your editors or bosses in New York, "Don't bother me now, I'm covering a war." So you're not doing any minor work. What you're doing is major work. You're writing the first drafts of history.
By the fall of 1958, both Kearns and Mazarov had been given full-time jobs with the network.
In those days, CBS had a 2-tier system. That is, there were reporters who were called reporters, believe it or not. And then there was a tier called CBS News Correspondent. And that was a very small elite tier, and you had to really bust your back to be promoted. To become a CBS News Correspondent was a badge of honor, okay? And when I first joined CBS News, few people had that badge, very few, and mostly they were the Murrow boys.
For the next 3 years, Frank Kearns covered the Middle East and Africa as a full-time CBS News correspondent based in Cairo.
The greatest enemy, politics aside, for all of the UN troops here, troops from 10 nations, is very simple: boredom. The new and secret weapon of the Brazilians, brought 6,000 miles from their homeland, is the samba.
He still tracked communist influence, but his attention shifted to the struggle of nations and of people. Countries in Africa and the Middle East were gaining their independence from European colonialism. Now, the question was whether these newly formed, yet fragile governments needed American support.
Would you say your government is pro-West or anti-West?
I say that we are pro any government that help us and work friendly with us.
Here in the Gaza Strip, it's obvious that the Palestinians are jubilant only at what they regard as liberation from the Israeli occupying forces.
In 1961, CBS closed its Cairo bureau because Egypt was censoring reports by foreign newsmen. As a result, Frank Kearns was given a temporary assignment back in New York. Joe Mosroff went to Paris.
I missed Cairo dreadfully, and so did my mother. And my father was not particularly happy in corporate CBS.
For the next 10 months, Frank Kearns filed stories from CBS headquarters. But within a year, he was back on the ground in Algeria. He was more comfortable in the field than he was in the office. Independence movements were gaining momentum throughout Africa, and their stories grew in importance. CBS promoted Kearns to Africa Bureau Chief in 1963.
His knowledge of Africa was very thorough. He had contacts. Wherever we went, Frank had somebody that he knew from travel before, and that we would invite for dinner and have interesting discussions, and I would always listen. Was great. I would admire Frank about his knowledge of Africa.
Frank Kearns remained the Africa Bureau Chief until 1971. Throughout his career, he covered stories in Europe as well as in the Middle East and Africa. The Aberfan mining disaster in Wales, thalidomide babies in Germany, the 6 Days War between the Egyptians and the Israelis, the disastrous sinking of the Torrey Canyon oil tanker off the south coast of England, the Paris peace talks, and the street battles in Northern Ireland.
What I recall from the Northern Ireland story is that it was very dangerous. The streets were burning. We were running through the streets, and people were chasing us, and we had to run for our lives, and we had to dash to a car to take us away from this angry crowd that wanted to kill us. And all I remember for Frank that time was that in the evening in the bar of the hotel, I remember Frank saying, "Josephine, more Irish whiskeys."
Kearns was away from home for almost 3/4 of his marriage with Gwendy. She stayed in London. He was now based in Rome. Their son attended boarding school. In the end, they had spent too much time apart and finally divorced. While on holiday with his son in Bermuda, Kearns met a young British Airways flight attendant, Sarah Demain, and began a long-distance relationship that quickly grew for both of them.
He was very insistent, and I stopped flying. I joined him on his war stories, and we spent time in Israel, in Egypt, in Paris, in Africa, and finally I gave up flying altogether and moved to Rome. And I knew then he was just the best.
Among the African countries that Frank Kearns followed closely was Nigeria. There, A series of military coups in the late 1960s launched a bloody civil war. The secessionist country in the eastern region was called Biafra. Kearns reported 5 times from this war zone. When the 30-month struggle drew to a close in 1970, Kearns returned to investigate how the defeated Igbos were being treated.
First impressions up here are deep and a little unnerving, disturbing. Everywhere we go, the people ask for food, are reduced to begging, or just stare pitifully, stunned, with the sad, sad stare of the hungry. Like all civil wars, this one was savage, all reflected in the faces of the defeated Igbo.
Reuters news agency reports tonight that almost all foreign newsmen who had visited Biafra are being detained in a Port Harcourt hotel. Nigerian officials are known to be upset over those news reports painting a grave picture of the defeated Igbos. We haven't found out whether Correspondent Kearns is being held.
After much negotiation, the Nigerians finally released all of the detained journalists. For Frank Kearns, this would be his last assignment in Africa.
He'd spent some time in a Nigerian prison, and he had some real health concerns after they let him out. What fairly sane man would face death, an average of more than once every 2 months, consistently over a period of 15 years. Yet my list, never completed, added up to a real eyeball to eyeball, cornea to cornea confrontation with death, 114 times. Frank Kearns.
He was offered a job back in the States, but that didn't suit Frank. And I think he realized then that he'd come to the end of the road with CBS.
Frank Kearns was 53 years old. From Dachau to Biafra, he'd seen the worst of how people could suffer, and he didn't want to see any more fighting or killing. Covering these stories was stressful and affected his health.
It's a pity that he didn't have as high a reputation as some of his colleagues who, quite frankly, were not up to his standard. But they were in different jobs and different countries, and they got on the air more. And what is it all about? Getting on the air. And Frank had to struggle to get on the air because of the kind of stories that he covered, which, frankly, I don't think were of great interest to the American public or to the foreign editor of the time. Africa was just so far away.
Kearns decided he didn't want to be a war correspondent anymore. As he was contemplating his future, Kearns agreed to briefly return to the United States to speak at his alma mater, West Virginia University. This reunion with family and old friends, as well as the reception he received while on campus, inspired him to accept an offer to use his experience as a foreign correspondent in the classroom. In 1971, Frank Kearns retired from CBS News.
I know when he first came aboard, he said, I'm a little uneasy about this business of teaching students. He said, I've never done this before. But I think we can say without a doubt that he took to teaching very easily, and it wasn't any time at all until it was just a nice fit, and he was doing a great job.
And if you could get some quiet time, he would tell you those war stories about being a foreign correspondent and being in Egypt and being in Africa. And I could remember sitting there just as a young student thinking, this is great. I'm in the presence of this man who has done these things, and just soaking it up and just hanging on every word of these stories that he would tell about these faraway places. And it was all very intoxicating and all very exotic. And told in his office where there were pictures of Morley Safer and Walter Cronkite and Mike Wallace. They would all have written on there, inscribed, to Frank, all the best, or to Frank, remember Cairo. And it was magical to sit there. And I remember thinking that this was a big deal for me, to be in his presence as a teacher. I could learn a lot from him. In fact, I want to be like him. I want to learn from him, then I want to follow in his footsteps.
Kearns and one of his students were meeting in his office on the afternoon of February 10th, 1976, when they were interrupted by a telephone call. The person on the other end was Daniel Shore. He was about to mention Kearns on the CBS Evening News.
Sig Mickelson, the former president of CBS News, today identified two newsmen as having had CIA connections while serving as CBS News stringers, part-time correspondents. Mickelson said he had learned from CIA Director Allen Dulles in 1956 that Frank Kearns, CBS News stringer in Cairo, was employed by the CIA.
Sandy Sokoloff was in Eric Severide's office in the CBS Washington bureau. The phone rang. It was Frank Kearns.
Kearns and Severide were having this conversation. I'm standing over Severide's desk. I can't quite hear what's going on, but it's quite a lengthy conversation, and Severide hangs up and kind of like, whew. He said, that was Frank Kearns, and I think he was crying or on the verge of crying, and he just didn't understand why we reported his involvement with the CIA and didn't understand what the use of it was, what good did it do, what was the purpose of it, why was it necessary, and on and on and on and on. And Severide was quite shook up by the call.
Frank Kearns vigorously denied working for the CIA. He denied it to everyone who asked him about it. He even prepared notes to handle a barrage of inquiries from reporters.
I must have been naive, but a number of times I expected I would be approached or debriefed after being in a hot spot or having an exclusive story. But to my knowledge, never, not once was I knowingly approached in all my years as staff correspondent for CBS News. Frank Kearns.
More than a year after the Kearns allegation first appeared, CBS Chairman William S. Paley issued a formal statement explaining the network's relationship with the CIA during the Cold War years. He said it was limited, and that he felt it was his duty to cooperate in ways that seemed not only innocuous, but patriotic. Just to be clear, Paley also said that Kearns has denied ever having worked for the CIA.
The atmosphere and culture was so different. In Frank Kearns' day, every year, both CBS and NBC would call all their foreign correspondents back to New York at Christmas time and would put on a broadcast, a roundtable. And following that, the correspondents would be sent on trips, or throughout the United States to talk to interested groups who were interested in foreign policy. But among their stops was a stop in Washington to talk to the CIA. And this was not secret or hidden, and nobody gave it a thought. And they would go to CIA and they'd get debriefed.
I think that there was probably, again, degrees of understanding, of cooperation between a network or a newspaper and the U.S. government. Sure, and I think it would be logical that it would be that way. But that is decidedly different from taking an assignment from the U.S. government, doing something on behalf of the U.S. government, knowing that as a reporter you were going out not really just to find a story and the curiosity and the interest that we had to find things out, but that you were doing something for the government. No. Honestly, I can't even imagine that happening.
Personally, I don't believe any legitimate newsman employed by a legitimate news organization should have any connection whatsoever with any intelligence organization. Absolutely not. Frank Kearns.
If one was a foreign correspondent or working for a news agency during the 50s and 60s, and you're in these remote parts of the world, that you would probably have sources in the intelligence community, and perhaps you would help them and they would help you, and maybe he was a stringer for them as well as it was for the CBS, that you're exchanging information. And knowing what I know now about gathering information, that's how information's gathered. You form relationships. It's not always pretty. Could his role have been even greater in the CIA? Who knows, because Frank was so good at deadpanning. He was so good at not sharing information. He would have been a good spy.
So whatever you think of Frank Kearns' case, whether you think he was right or wrong, he certainly was not the only person who was involved in this. So from that standpoint, yeah, Kearns is right. That, in a sense, he took the fall for a lot of other people. Now, who in CBS decided it was Frank Kearns, that I can't tell you.
I never had any doubts that Frank was a CIA agent. At the same time, he was a CBS News employee. But at the same time, every time I say that, I want to say that CBS management was right there and knew about it. Frank Kearns was not a renegade.
If you look at the investigative articles that did come out in the 1970s, the CIA didn't have just 3 or 5 or a dozen journalists that were connected with it. You know, whether you call them agents or contract officers, there were hundreds.
Mickelson also said that Austin Goodrich, who had been a CBS News stringer in Stockholm, had been identified to him as working for the CIA. Goodrich's present whereabouts could not be ascertained.
I guess it was the fact that I worked for a time with both CBS and CIA. It seemed to be a very sinful activity. I never felt there was a moral problem with it at all.
This is Austin Goodrich reporting for the 20th Century.
When I was a journalist, I really was a journalist. I had my heart in it, my intelligence, everything I had to offer, and I was good as a reporter. And when I was working on a secret mission, I was a spook, and I enjoyed that too.
In a response to a Freedom of Information Act request for any CIA files on Frank Kearns, the agency replied that it can neither confirm nor deny the existence or non-existence of the requested records.
He was really very much disturbed by the story. Hurt, I would say, that, CBS would say anything like that about him. And it continued to deny it for as long as I knew him. But it was probably one of those aches or pains that lived with him for the rest of his life.
And I think it affected him. I think, in all honesty, it probably ended up killing him. He was mortified. I mean, he was angry.
A year after the CBS-CIA story broke, Richard Salant, then the president of CBS News, told the Los Angeles Times that it would be too strong to say he was a spy. He was just one of those people that, when he found out things, he would pass it along to the CIA. If Frank Kearns had any relationship with the agency during his years in Egypt, his experience in Algeria changed the way he reported news. Thereafter, he no longer framed stories with what can now be called the CIA's point of view. He seemed less concerned about America versus communism. Instead, his focus was on the growth of nationalism and the pursuit of independence, which may or may not have enjoyed Marxist support. The CIA allegation had cut deeply into Kearns' psyche. He spent his entire career upholding the highest standards of journalism practiced at CBS News. What began as post-World War II propaganda and packaged as news for consumption at home later took on a more measured worldview as television journalism matured. Frank Kearns stayed at West Virginia University for 7 more years. Finally, in 1983, he and Sarah moved to Sardinia, where he planned to write about his experiences. But serious health issues soon emerged, and over the next 3 years he struggled with cancer and also with writer's block. There were things he knew, and probably there were things he knew he could not tell.
Former CBS News correspondent Frank Kearns died today, cancer. He was 68. Death came in New York. His reporting on CBS radio and television came mostly from datelines such as Baghdad, Khartoum, Yemen, and the Congo. He took the tough stories and never complained through the 1950s and 60s and on into the 70s. More recently, he taught journalism at the University of West Virginia. Legend may be an overworked word among journalists, but in his quiet, courageous way, Frank Kearns was one around here.
He was a one-off. I don't remember the other networks having anybody of Frank's caliber on the Africa scene.
It's a correspondence commentary which is the key to the story, and if it's not, and that's what makes it really important and really valid. And I think the Americans invented that, and CBS was probably right there at the very beginning, and people like Frank must have pioneered this method, which gave it the distinction and quality which I think still is the hallmark of good. You know, you want to know what the correspondent thinks.
Well, in the 60s and the 70s, you actually gathered news. I mean, you had you had a beat. It may have been all of Africa. It may have been the Middle East. It may have been just Israel. Whatever your beat was, and you actually covered the news. You went there. You schmoozed with people. You got to know people. You can't simply parachute into a story and understand what's going on. And for one thing, if you parachute into a story, you're there too late. I don't think there's a place nowadays for Frank Kearns, and we're all. I mean this seriously. We're all the poorer for it.
2 wounded on the Army side, and unknown number wounded on the rebel side. A quiet Saturday afternoon in Beirut, Lebanon. This is Frank Kearns in Beirut, now back to CBS News in New York.
Major funding for Frank Kearns, American Correspondent, was provided by Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina and by the West Virginia Humanities Council. Additional funding was provided by Elizabeth Lake Schumann, the Leucadia National Foundation, and the Joseph S. and Diane H. Steinberg Charitable Trust.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.